Welcome to Tuesdays with Turbine on this beautiful late September morning. I'm Lee Fatzinger, CEO of the news ingesting, bias busting, dirty data cleaning Turbine Labs. Today's episode is a topic that I have been looking forward to covering, I think probably for at least a year. No opting out, a discussion on diversity and inclusion. Our guests today are Amber Wen, who is a diversity and inclusion expert at a major tech company based in California, somewhere on the West Coast. We're not going to say exactly where. And of course, Sarah Evans, who's the founder of Seven's strategy and digital PR, as well as the first person I knew to make it completely acceptable to have your kids crisscrossing your Zoom meetings. Thank you both for joining Turbine Tuesdays with Turbine today. All right, let's get started with the volume check first. This is where the folks back in the Turbine point our AI-powered platform out there into the media and public conversation space so that we can quickly understand the impact of a topic. Appropriately, this week's volume check is on the topic of diversity and inclusion. And we opened up the field of view somewhat on this topic to explore D&I over the last 10 days. Not surprisingly, the topic earned a very high volume of articles, with the Turbine ingesting, if you can believe this, almost 20,000 unique articles that met the D&I criteria, which means it could have been a keyword or phrase match within the article. But when the Turbine reads the article from the perspective of a human reader, we're able to determine that only a fraction of those articles, about 700, were actually highly impactful to the topic. So as it turns out, if you wanted to get really informed about D&I, Forbes was the ideal source, and they published 3 highly impactful articles on the topic of D&I within the last 10 days. And within the whole set of high and medium impact articles, 58% of those were focused on President Trump's ban on critical race theory diversity training in federal agencies. The ban was then expanded to include the US military, government contractors, and other federal grantees. Okay, that's the volume check for today. Let's turn back to our panel.
Thank you so much, Lee. Thanks for having us. And I get the role of moderating today, which
right.
is that's important to me, but because it's really moderating and listening. And I would love the folks watching to know that you and Amber and myself have actually had hours of discussion offline and off the part of on camera, because this is such an important topic and we really want to give it the respect and attention it deserves. So while I play the role of moderator, I'm also playing the role of listener today. So I get the job of asking all of the questions for the hours of discussion that we've had prior. So I want to jump right in. Number one, it's uncomfortable to call out and acknowledge your company might not be where it needs to be in terms of diversity and inclusion. And many times this can start as a feeling. So I want to talk about how companies can move from altruistic feelings to action. So take the step where I've acknowledged it's not right, I've got feelings about this, now what do we do?
Of course. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all as well. And Sarah, I probably should thank you. I did not know you were the person who made it acceptable for our kids to jump in on our Zoom meetings, but I, along with probably every other working parent right now, I thank you for that because it's a reality of how we're living right now. But to your question, yeah, I mean, it is uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable to be called out on anything where you're not where you need to be. But certainly as an organization, particularly organizations with really good intentions, right? Organizations that exist to do good in the world in particular, when they look around and see that an unintentional lack of focus on something like diversity, equity, inclusion, typically leads to a lot of measures and sort of like experiences that we don't intend, right? So I often say, like, when you don't intentionally include, you usually unintentionally exclude, because this work is so incredibly layered. This work and the things that we talk about show up in micro behaviors. They show up in like decisions and policies. So the things that I think are important is that, you know, acknowledge where you are, be transparent about where you are. And to do that, I feel like metrics, that's one of the first places that I instruct any group that I ever work with to start, because the same way that we would manage any other business priority in our organizations is how we need to start when we think about approaching the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So start off with what you know, right? What you can grab. Can you actually get a look at your representation numbers, right? There's probably reports that you're already doing that can show you where different sort of diversity dimensions are either represented or where they're lacking. So take a look at those numbers, see what you look like from a diversity perspective as it relates to things like gender, which is something that we talk about globally, right? Like gender is a dimension that for the most part, we acknowledge globally, it's tracked globally. So that's where an easy one to start with typically. And then certainly for companies that are based in the US in particular as well, race, ethnicity, that's one that you can't do a diversity, you can't do diversity work without in some way acknowledging that group. And so, you know, I often say, you know, you start with the metrics because the metrics matter. If you have an employee satisfaction survey, you should be looking at that, but then you should also be cutting it by different diversity dimensions. So maybe when you look at that holistically, it looks like people are having a great experience, but then when you cut it by different dimensions, when you say, okay, let's look at women, let's look at women who've been here for 3 years, let's look at people of color who are within certain levels of the organization. You know, like where do we see people seem as though their experiences are really well and they're really engaged, things are going well, and then there's a sudden drop? Does that happen at a certain time in someone's tenure? Like where can we start to really uncover what is going on in our organization or things that are being unsaid? So there's a lot of different ways to go about that, but that to me usually is the first place that you start when you're trying to go from, I feel a certain way about this, to, okay, where do I start? And where can I really find those meaningful opportunities that are going to drive real change?
And Lee, moving from what Amber just said, I know that you're a very invested leader and CEO and care deeply and are already taking actions. What advice would you have to leaders to add in leadership assessments or other behaviors to hold themselves accountable to diversity and inclusion?
Well, it's a great question. One of the things that, so for me, and over the last year, it's been all learning. And I think one of the things that CEOs, especially of small companies and small companies based in places like Denver, you have to acknowledge that this is something that you want to do. You want to take it on. And that's where everything starts to unravel, actually. You think that by having intent that you're making progress, and we're going to go into the intent versus impact in just a second, but as a precursor to that, you think you're on a path because you're thinking about it, and what you realize is that if this is going to be a priority for your company, if you're going to set it into the DNA of the business at its earliest stages, that it actually takes a lot more outreach and a lot more effort than just saying we're going to be a diverse and inclusive company or organization or whatever. And at that moment, you have to start sitting down and planning, what does that actually look like? Who is going to handle these things? How are you going to get involved with the community? How are you going to make sure that, just as Amber was saying, in phases of people's development in the organization, as their experiences change and as the sort of the character of the whole organization changes, do they continue to feel included? Do they continue to feel supported? So in other words, the work starts after you have the intent, but the intent is not the work.
Well said.
I love that, Lee. So really we're talking about embracing the discomfort, and then Lee, you gave a gave it away that we're moving into intent versus impact, because it really does matter. So Amber, I'll start with you. What is the biggest error you've seen companies make consistently? And what could make a difference to help avoid it in the future?
Oh yeah. So one of the common mistakes I see that is usually related to good intentions, right? One is taking on this work and figuring out how you're going to, support it or resource it, and saying one of a few things, like one being like, okay, well, let's find the people of color or the women or whoever fits into a certain diversity dimension. And we'll just have them run this, right? Someone who, not putting a lot of thought necessarily into the skills that it actually might take to lead something like this, right? To build something like this. So I see that happen often. And then I see sometimes a lot of difficulty around prioritizing, right? Because so much in this space is about, it all feels really good. Usually when it comes to developing diversity initiatives and doing something that's going to move, like evolve the culture and like really impact your organization, what it looks like and how it operates, so much of it feels really good. And you'll hear about things that are happening at different organizations and you'll say like, oh yeah, we should be doing that. We should try this, we should try that. And unfortunately, that is not an approach that gets a lot done, right? The idea of boiling the ocean. So I see that happening a lot. I see not a lot of thought put into the leaders and the teams that are going to be leading this type of work. Because, in addition to having like some sort of connection, right? Like something that actually drives you to want to do this type of work day in and day out, that's important. But in addition to that, you need skills like change management skills. You need to be able to influence and persuade. You need to have a pretty good grasp of data and analytics to be able to go through and see, like we were talking about before, okay, here's what the data is telling me. What can I gain from this that actually will inform the plans that I want to put in place? You have to have a lot of resilience, grit, patience, like those types of things are really, really important. And I see companies sometimes just go off of like passion. This person's really passionate about this, so I'm just going to put them in the role, and they'll figure out how to make it work. And then I also just see just taking on way too much, particularly in the beginning.
I just want to add, from our perspective, Amber's correct in that if you have somebody that is looking at how do we take this on as a priority, if it doesn't come from the top, if it is just an assignment that's given to somebody that says, listen, our public perception is going to be better if we have a D&I program, then you're really asking for failure in that initiative. And what's interesting about this is that if you're not organized about it, it can actually be worse for your organization than better. So from the top down, it has to be, this is going to be a core principle of ours that we're going to heed and honor like anything else. We're going to serve our customers. We're going to, grow to the benefit of our shareholders. We are going to have a diverse and inclusive workplace. In other words, they go right there. If it is a subset of a subset of a priority, then it's not going to work. And that also helps make sure that the organization understands that it's a priority. And in a small organization like ours, I'm fascinated when I hear people at large organizations talk about that, because they have these kind of resources and they can bring in experts in change management and how to hire and how to create workplaces that map to where we are as a society today. And if you're a smaller organization, it just means that you have to be more organized, that you have to take on, first of all, you have to be principled from the top. And at the underneath that, you have to start to take on tasks that you can, that you can see from end to end, and actually accomplish those tasks, because it can become very, very fuzzy. And just as Amber was saying, that if you try something and it's not a priority, it just sort of, something will always have a higher priority. It'll just, move out of the way. And again, that's what goes back to good intentions versus action.
And one of the things that I was thinking about as you both were talking is, we talked about metrics, we're talking about data. At some point, someone can say, well, we've checked off all these boxes. We are diverse and inclusive. It is not that simple. We all know that. So how do you look at longevity in terms of impact versus that initial, okay, well, now we've identified that we are not inclusive or diverse. So we have, step one, step two. Well, what comes next?
Amber, do you mind if I want to just add something very quickly to this question, because it's at Turbine Labs, we're a technology and engineering organization, and we're an AI company, and the only way that you can really have an unbiased, objective perspective on the issues and output that we're doing for our customers is to have a diverse and unbiased and objective perspective from every area that develops that product. And that includes, we employ a lot of journalists and we employ a lot of engineers. And so you have to go out and make sure that your teams map to the makeup of our society. It's a lot of outreach that has to happen. You can't just say, well, we put out a job description and we didn't get candidates that map to the makeup of society. Well, we tried.
Right. Yeah. I actually have, like, a number of my friends are, like, English is not their first language. Right. And, it's interesting. They've told me over the years that many of them have told me that try is one of those words that doesn't translate into, like, a number of different languages. Like, it's just like, they're like, we don't really have that word that means what it seems like you're trying to get across in terms of, like, try. It's like you do it or you don't do it. Right. So it's like when you say, like, well, we tried, like, that's not enough in most circumstances, right? But certainly not when it comes to this type of work. I think that one of the things that I see needing more attention is, particularly at the onset when a company is taking on this type of work, is thinking about, like, a vision, right? And or an overall sort of, like, maturity model that says, like, this is where we are today. And when we look at, the evolution of diversity and inclusion in organizations at large, right? And there's a bunch of different maturity models that exist out there. You could Google them. We would place ourselves, if the model goes from 1 to 5, we place ourselves at a 1, right? Which is like, we've never really talked about this. There's no really organized efforts around this. There might have been things that speak to this in some way, but it hasn't really been the part of a holistic strategy, right? That we were actually investing in and pushing forward. Or you say, maybe we're at a 2, wherever you are. And then saying, in order for us to get to a 5, right? If that's the ultimate goal, where these principles are so deeply embedded in everything that we do and every decision that we make, that it's almost like reflexive. Like, it's not even something that we have to say, oh, let's remember to think about D&I, or, oh, let's go get the D&I lady and make sure she's here when we're making these decisions. Like, no, it's a part of how we think. It's a part of how we write our job descriptions. When it comes to our relationships with organizations, we think about how we tap into different diverse communities. We hold our leaders accountable through incentive programs, right? Like, if we do an employee satisfaction survey and there are questions that relate to diversity, inclusion, belonging, whatever, and you have a leader that consistently scores poorly on that, that's reflected either in their performance review or their incentive, their packages and things like that. Like, all of these things, I talk a lot sometimes about, there's structural changes and then there's behavioral changes. So you talked about, but the point came up about, you have large organizations that have tons of resources. And sometimes that's even more difficult, because sometimes large organizations just lack the agility to be able to say, like, okay, we're going to focus in on these certain behaviors that are, like you said, threatening our culture when it comes to these particular issues of like diversity and inclusion. And so to do that, here's what we're kicking off, right? Like here's a way in which we're going to lean into this and really figure out how these behaviors show up, how we call them out, how we mitigate these, you know, whether it's bias, you know, here's the set of initiatives that we're going to do. Because, you know, structural changes, you know, you can change a policy and how it's written. You can change how, you know, your recruiters recruit. You can change a lot of things, but what is harder to change is how people behave on an everyday basis. Like I said, like the micro decisions and behaviors and interactions that over time build up and threaten one's feelings of belonging or psychological safety. That stuff's harder to change. And I think the larger your organization is, the easier those things are to hide. You know, like the easier it is for unconscious bias to creep in and impact decisions and interactions. And so, you know, every company is going to have its challenges, but I think every company, big or small, also has advantages that they can use about how they're structured or about how their culture works that could help in their efforts to move this D&I work along.
Amber, one of the things you said, my apologies, Sarah. One of the things you said in our previous conversations that I thought was pivotal, because to me, it distilled down what we're trying to do here. And that is how to manage across difference.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that's happened, because rightly so, this topic of pay equality and diversity, all these the terms, which sound great, but what they don't include is, okay, I want pay equality. I want to make sure that everyone feels safe at our company, no matter what their background is, no matter where they come from, no matter who they are. That everyone is judged based on their skills and what they contribute to the company and nothing else. But when it comes to just this overarching principle, executives, especially like me, need sort of what are the defining statements that you can just sort of replicate in your head that allow that to permeate through the organization. And when you said how to manage across difference, that really struck me as that's the problem that we're trying to solve. Okay. And by the way, at some point, and I don't think you ever fully solve it, and I also don't think it's necessarily a problem, but it is. This is the task. How do you manage across difference? And for me, that brought it down into away from its labels, if you will, and into this is what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
It simplified it for me, and I have to say that was in all the conversations that I've had about this as a growing company, that was probably one of the most impactful I'd heard.
Oh, that's awesome. You know, and it's funny because there's simple things that have been, you know, shared. You know, one of the quotes that comes up a lot that's really simple as that one is, that seems to resonate is, you know, people when trying to understand diversity versus inclusion, and like how Brene Myers, who's the chief diversity officer at Netflix now, who's been doing this work forever, she's like a huge influence in the space. She says, she has a quote about diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, right? And that's something that people like, I used to have like 60-page decks that I'd be like, you know, going through all the metrics and the stories and then they would be like, you know what you said that really resonated? It was that. And so those are the things like, you know, when you talk about managing across difference, that's something that's a light bulb to some people, because when you think about how you hire, right? And the questions that you might ask somebody when you're asking them about their leadership style, or, you know, what's important to them, or like, you know, something they're really proud of in terms of how they've been able to manage their teams or, you know, manage through difficult moments or whatever. You have that switch that says like, oh, this is a leadership skill that I need to be interviewing for. Like I shouldn't bring people on who would not have a meaningful answer to that, right? Like I should be able to say that I've sort of covered this the same way I would say I've covered, ethics and compliance or whatever those core skills are for the particular role. And managing across difference, it's simple to say, but in practice, we know it's a lot more challenging because the difference to be, we're talking about working parents now, right? Like, do you have a sense of when you're leading your teams, I remember I heard a leader say something to the effect of like, well, now we don't have commutes. So I'm just going to start every meeting at like 7:30, 8:00 a.m. because that's when people would be traveling to work, and now we're not traveling to work. I'm sorry, I don't know if you have children, but like that time period is where, particularly if you're going through homeschooling or whatever it is, you're like that is
under the table right now.
Yeah, exactly.
See, Sarah?
Yeah, there's challenges, and I wonder sometimes, when you talk about effectively managing across differences, sometimes it's just about being open and knowing that you just don't know what you don't know, right? So like being able to ask a question like, does this work for the team? Does anybody have any challenges where this might actually make it more difficult? Like let's talk about that.
So that is a perfect segue to talk about true investment. And the term investment may be really overwhelming to companies. Number one, if you're a small business, you might not have the financials because you think about it in terms of finance to invest. And number two, Amber, you brought up a phenomenal point about just the understanding of what diversity and inclusion is. An investment might be training for leadership or executives just to get to the point where they can understand what this actually means. So if we look at true investment in terms of time, resources, and follow through, what does that look like?
I think that a term that everyone should know when they embark upon this work is diversity fatigue. And I might not have talked about this in our call before, but it's a very real feeling that people get when, like we said, they're feeling really energetic about this work. They want to dive in. They want to give it all they have, like either from an organizational perspective or from a personal perspective. And then after 6 months, when the world hasn't necessarily changed or shifted in this dramatic way as you thought it may, you feel a little bit defeated, right? And that's why I talked about how resilience and grit is so important, because we are unpacking years and years of systemic barriers that go beyond any one organization, right? Like we are, when people are asking about, like, when we're having these conversations about privilege and power dynamics, and like when you talked about like pay equity, like there's so much that goes into the space that we're in right this second. I think it's important for any organization to, like I said before, think about the overall vision, right? And think about this as a long-term investment. So we're going to invest in these things at the very beginning. And maybe it's like what you said, Sarah, like maybe it's, identifying a leader, allowing that leader to build a strong team, ensuring, like you said, Lee, there's top of the house responsibility, involvement, and investment, like you said, of time, resource, like, ensuring that the leadership team understands the level of priority that's being placed on this. All of those things, like it's a multi-pronged approach that goes into actually making a function like this work and making sure that progress is made. So I think that, building for the long term is important, right? This is a marathon, it's not a sprint.
Yeah.
I think also ensuring that you build a plan that allows you to also celebrate milestones and wins along the way. So like sometimes there's a big hairy goal that we're all really focused on, but there's usually moments that lead up to that show progress, that we could say, okay, well, we haven't reached our, 45% increase in whatever dimension of diversity we want to see in leadership or wherever. But from, last year to this year, we saw an increase of 14%. Like we're moving in the right direction. And so like, how can we celebrate the fact that like we've seen progress there? So, like any huge change that needs to be made, it's all about the day-to-day decisions and like the milestones and micro moments, like I keep talking about, that lead up to it. So, when you talk about investment, I think that, that has to be something that's looked at holistically, that's looked at long-term, and that has many different forms in which it comes in, right? So am I sort of carving out time for my leaders to gain the skills that I'm telling them they need to have, right? Because like you said, some people have never been exposed to this type of stuff. And hopefully that's a change that we'll start to see in our workplaces, where you won't be able to have worked for 20 years and never have talked about diversity and inclusion, right? Like hopefully that's a change that's coming. But in the meantime, yeah, like I'm telling folks that this is important, but I'm also giving you time to learn. I'm giving you time to build the skills.
Lee, from your perspective, one of the things that I think about with investment also is you're focusing on diversity and inclusion. And if an organization is at that one number, like Amber mentioned, and all of a sudden maybe you're moving to a 6 or an 8, you've now completely changed the makeup of your team, your staff, the people actually running the business. And that can also change dynamics of how you are working. How do you think leaders should plan for that adjustment? So the inclusive is asking people to dance. You get all these people in the door and you're more mindful of that. How does the dance happen?
For us, it's been, you have to be open to sort of watching things unfold. And so if you set the right priorities, if you say this is going to be a strategic priority, that we are going to say that listening and empathy are characteristics that we want to have as core to our business also. And then you have to let things evolve somewhat. And this has really, for us, been pivotal in the COVID environment, where we're not in a room together, that I'd say in some ways the Zoom environment makes things more formal, in that it's harder to talk over each other that you in a way you would in a conference room. But at the same time, the little things of life that happen, the kids come in, the computer runs out of battery. I mean, all of these things that happen. And I often think back to, my father was in the steel business for 40 years in a very sort of buttoned up executive environment, and there was a lot of formality, and there would have been no discussion around the empathy of a working mom, not replacing commute time with work time, that working mom needs to be at home to make sure that the lesson plans are set up so that the work can get done through the rest of the day. That's a discussion that not very long ago just wouldn't have happened. And so for us, the allowing to be a little bit out of control, we don't know what it's going to be like. Are we going to be able to work in this kind of an environment? And what we've found is that we have happier people in this environment because they have more flexibility. They can spend more time with their families. And so that was an unintended benefit of being a knowledge worker in this time. And I want to make very, very clear that this is a tiny, tiny subset of the workforce. And as it relates to D&I, a much larger set of the workforce doesn't have the luxuries that knowledge workers have. So I don't have the answer on how you solve that problem for physical presence jobs. But I know for us, and maybe we've just been given a pass, and it's been made a little bit easier because we have been able to observe. And so the principles that we had, and then you just say, well, let's listen, let's be empathetic, and then you watch it. And the consequence of that has been, well, a lot more stuff is getting done and people are happier. So that's a great outcome. And I tend to sort of caution myself by saying, okay, well, that's great that you have that outcome, but what about everybody else? And in that case, there's a lot of people out there who are really, really struggling, but and it's a different issue to solve. But I think you have to sort of let things happen. And Amber, you made this statement, especially as it relates to if you want the candidates that you feel like you need in the hiring process to represent the goal you're trying to achieve. Sometimes you just have to slow down, and you have to let that aperture widen so that what you're looking for comes to you through your efforts.
I think that's a great answer, Lee. And it's important that you talk about your own experience, because you're not alone in being, a leader of knowledge workers. And then we get feedback from people who have a completely different scenario.
Yep.
One of the things that in any conversation that we have, things tend to move back and forth between metrics and maybe the softer side of things, of empathy, right? But that's life, because we want to measure things and we have to do things. But when we talk about metrics in terms of diversity and inclusion, and we're listing out percentages, we're actually talking about people. There are human lives behind those numbers. So how do we maybe even frame the way we talk about metrics? And Amber, you'd be great to start with this. So how do we measure people and how they look or who they are, and still have empathy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's another model that I'll leave you all with. Hopefully there's like a few things that resonate. But yeah, over time, I've talked a lot and seen a lot of progress with the head, heart, and hand model. And I'm not sure if this is something that everyone has heard in different capacities, but it totally relates to diversity and inclusion work as well. Because the thing is, like, you think about the head being, okay, how do I understand this from a very like metrics driven perspective, right? Like from a 1 and 1 equals 2, like this is what I'm seeing as it relates to representation. This is what I'm seeing in terms of mobility through the organization for different groups. Here's what I'm seeing in terms of employee experience, attrition, promotions, like all that type of stuff. And then you have the heart aspect of it, which is like what you've been talking about, Lee, right? Which is like my personal story, my connection to this work, and understanding that like no matter who you are and what diversity dimensions you represent, there is a story that you have that relates to this work, right? It could be as a leader, it could be as something very personal, as you were talking about, like your father, like there is something. I sometimes start with the story of like, there's a few, but like my mother naming me Amber because she didn't want people to know whether or not I was Black when I applied for jobs.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, like when she first told me that, I was like, I reject that. I think I'm going to change my name right now. But again, she was living through a different time. She grew up in corporate America as well. And for her, the name of the game was assimilation. Like that's what it was. That's how you got ahead, by downplaying whatever made you different from the norm, or from the people who had, the power. So, that's like the heart aspect. And then the hand is basically, which we talked about in the beginning, like, what am I going to do now that I know this? What am I going to do different? Like, what am I going to stop, start, or continue? Like those actual action plans that get developed, that people are really holding themselves to and being accountable to, like that's a model that I've seen really be powerful for people to understand, like it's not enough just to look at the metrics, and it's not enough just to sit around and listen to stories, right? Like these things have to come together so that we understand the why behind what it is we're doing. But then we're, like I said before, we're managing this the same way we manage any other business priority, where we say, here's our goals, here's our strategies and tactics of how we're getting there, here's how we hold ourselves accountable. And if we don't reach certain things, here's what happens next. Like that, those things, it's important in this space just as it is in any other. But I think when you have all of those sort of gears working together, that's when you don't miss out on the people in between the numbers, and you don't over-index on the stories instead of the policies and the structures that actually will make change. Like, all of that stuff has to work together.
I also think that if you tune that appropriately, and again, this is a process to perfection that I don't think anybody ever perfects, because the societal changes that we're seeing in 2020, which are multifaceted, right? Pandemic, economic calamity, racial injustice, how we're choosing our leaders, all of those things are happening this year that weren't there last year, but there was a whole different set of circumstances last year. And I think if you look at that, you're always having to maintain it. But I also think that if you work on perfecting that, or you prioritize that, that actually helps in a lot of other areas of the business. It helps in how you sell. It helps in how you develop your products. It helps in how you do the finances of the business. It helps in how you choose your board. All of those things happen in a way where that methodology doesn't necessarily apply to the CFO's office, but if it did, your business would be better.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there are things you can carry that we wouldn't have considered in years past, but because of the complexity and the nuance of this particular priority in society, we have an opportunity to just make companies better. All right, so now let's move to Lee's soapbox. For those who run fast-growing companies, we have the opportunity to build diversity and inclusion into the DNAs of our cultures and our operations, and the earlier, the better. But it takes a tremendous amount of effort and outreach. As we talked about, it's not enough to have a policy here or there. In some ways, policy is taken care of by the government. To truly manage difference among employees, everyone in the organization needs to view all differences as a part of building a healthy, unique culture, as well as a differentiator. And at the same time, leaders of growing companies need to embrace their own discomfort, as you can see from mine that we've shown here, on what they don't know, ask lots of questions, and then weave those answers to those questions back into the culture of the organization.
Totally.
I have to say, every time we have a conversation about this, I learn so much. I realize how much I don't know. I still get feelings of discomfort that I want to work through and right. Well, exactly. Right. And that shows me and our organization that the work is not yet done. So Amber, thank you so much for joining us. Sarah, as always, it's great to see you. On next Tuesdays with Turbine, staying focused in a perpetually noisy world, I'm super excited to welcome Mr. Peter Shankman. Peter is the founder of Help a Reporter Out, which he built and then sold in 2010. He's also the author of a book called Faster Than Normal, a fantastic book about people with ADHD and how they can fine-tune and supercharge their brains and get more things done faster. Until next Tuesday, thanks so much for joining us.